Great minds of humanity, celebrating human brilliance.
Somewhere in the vast Roman Empire, a man who commanded the most powerful military force in the known world sat alone each morning, not to plan conquests, not to count gold, but to write in a private journal that he never intended anyone to read. He ruled over 60 million people. He led Rome through plague, war, and political chaos. Yet when history looks back at him, it is not his armies they remember, it is his thoughts. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and he may be the closest thing to a philosopher king the world has ever seen. This is the story of a man who never wanted power, yet carried it better than almost anyone in history, a man who believed that the greatest empire worth conquering was the one inside your own mind. To understand Marcus Aurelius, we must first understand the world he was born into, our world of breathtaking power and equally breathtaking corruption. Rome in the 2nd century CE was the undisputed center of civilization, a city of 1 million people, the seat of an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria, from Morocco to Mesopotamia. But power in Rome was fragile and often lethal. In the century before Marcus was born, emperors had been stabbed by their own guards, poisoned by their own families, and torn apart by the very mobs they claimed to govern. Into this world, beautiful, sophisticated, and ruthlessly dangerous, a boy named Marcus Annius Verus was born on April 26, in the year 121 CE, in the hills of Rome. Marcus came from a distinguished Spanish-Roman family, the Annii, who had risen through generations of military service and political acumen to become one of the most respected houses in Rome. His father, Annius Verus, died when Marcus was only 3 years old. From that moment, his grandfather, a man of tremendous dignity and warmth, became his primary father figure. Marcus would later write in his private journal that his grandfather taught him to be gentle and meek, and to refrain from all anger and passion, values he carried with him for the rest of his life. The young Marcus showed remarkable intellectual promise from the very beginning, so much so that the reigning emperor Hadrian himself took notice of the boy and gave him the affectionate nickname Verissimus, meaning most genuine or most truthful. It was a remarkable endorsement, and it would have consequences no one could have anticipated. Marcus received the finest education the Roman world could offer, a carefully curated assembly of tutors in grammar, rhetoric, law, and philosophy, drawn from the greatest intellectual traditions of the Mediterranean. But among all his teachers, one man changed everything, a Stoic philosopher named Junius Rusticus, who placed in the hands of young Marcus a copy of the lectures of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the most profound thinkers of the ancient world. The philosophy of Stoicism struck the young Marcus like a revelation. It taught that the world outside your control is irrelevant, what matters is only how you respond to it with reason, virtue, and inner discipline. So seriously did Marcus take his new philosophical identity that, as a teenager, he began sleeping on the hard floor and wearing the rough cloak of a philosopher rather than the luxurious robes of a Roman nobleman, much to his family's alarm. This was the paradox that would define his entire life, a man of supreme worldly privilege choosing voluntarily to live by the disciplines of poverty, reason, and self-restraint. In 138 CE, Emperor Hadrian died. His chosen successor was a man named Antoninus Pius, and as a condition of his adoption and rise to power, Antoninus was required to adopt Marcus Aurelius as his own son. With a single legal ceremony, the teenage philosopher became heir to the greatest empire in the Western world. He was 17 years old, and he had never asked for any of it. Marcus spent the next 23 years as heir apparent, studying, writing, governing minor offices, and preparing for a responsibility he approached not with ambition but with a kind of philosophical duty. In 161 CE, Emperor Antoninus Pius died peacefully at the age of 74, leaving behind the most stable, prosperous Rome had seen in generations. Marcus Aurelius, now 40 years old, inherited the throne. In an extraordinary act that stunned the Roman court, Marcus immediately insisted on sharing imperial power with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, creating the first joint emperorship in Roman history. He refused to rule alone when he did not have to. The Stoic texts Marcus loved so much were full of elegant ideas about endurance and equanimity. Then reality arrived, and it was far less elegant. Within the first year of his reign, the Parthian Empire attacked Rome's eastern frontier. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and the Danube. And then, in 165 CE, soldiers returning from the east brought back something invisible and far more lethal than any enemy army, the Antonine Plague. The plague tore through the Roman Empire for 15 years, killing an estimated 5 million people, perhaps a third of the population in some regions. Marcus Aurelius watched helplessly as his subjects, his soldiers, and his own family members died around him. It was during these years of plague and war that Marcus began writing the private notes that would eventually become his Meditations, not as a treatise intended for public glory, but as a daily practice of self-correction, a private conversation with himself. In these writings, Marcus would remind himself to wake each morning expecting ingratitude and difficulty, because the Stoic philosopher knows that struggle is not a betrayal of life. It is life. In 167 CE, Marcus did something no Roman emperor had done in nearly a century. He personally led his armies to the northern frontier to fight the Germanic Marcomanni and Quadi tribes who were threatening to breach the Danube. He would spend much of the next 14 years on campaign, enduring brutal northern winters, supply shortages, military setbacks, and the death of his co-emperor Lucius Verus from the very plague they had been fighting. Each night on campaign, no matter how exhausted he was from the day's marching and command decisions, Marcus would take out his journal and write, examining his own thoughts, confronting his failures, and reminding himself of his philosophical obligations. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." These were not the words of a man insulated from suffering. These were hard-won conclusions forged in the coldest fields of experience. The wars on the northern frontier were eventually brought to a stabilized conclusion, not through annihilation, but through negotiation, resettlement, and the integration of Germanic peoples into the Roman system, a policy that was both pragmatic and ahead of its time. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180 CE, near the Danube frontier, in the field, among his soldiers, still serving. He was 58 years old. He died of what historians believe was the same plague that had ravaged his empire for 15 years. The Roman Empire mourned him with a depth of genuine grief that was unusual in a world where emperors were often feared more than beloved. He was consecrated as a divine emperor, deified by the Senate. Statues were erected across the empire. His private journal, written in Greek and never intended for publication, survived. Nearly 2,000 years later, we call it the Meditations. It has never been out of print. It has been read by rulers, generals, philosophers, artists, and ordinary people searching for meaning. The historian Edward Gibbon called the reign of Marcus Aurelius the period in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Historian after historian has confirmed, in the ancient world, Marcus Aurelius was as close to a just emperor as history ever produced. His column, the Column of Marcus Aurelius, still stands in Rome's Piazza Colonna, its spiral relief carvings depicting the Danube Campaign still legible after 2,000 years, a stone record of a philosopher who also bore the full weight of human history on his shoulders. What can a Roman emperor from the 2nd century CE possibly teach us today? Everything. Because the problems Marcus Aurelius faced are the same problems every human being faces: the temptation of ego, the distraction of things outside our control, the difficulty of acting with integrity when no one is watching. Marcus Aurelius proved that the inner life is not a luxury reserved for people with free time and simple lives. He ruled the most complex empire in the world and still found it both possible and necessary to examine his own thoughts every single day. His discipline was not performed for an audience, it was practiced in the dark, on a cold floor, in a campaign tent, in a private journal that no one was ever meant to read. The Meditations opens with something remarkable, not a declaration of greatness, but a list of people Marcus thanks for what they taught him. His grandfather, his parents, his tutors, his friends. The man who commanded 60 million people began his private masterpiece with gratitude. That alone tells you everything about who he really was. If the story of Marcus Aurelius moved you, if his discipline, his humility, and his relentless pursuit of wisdom resonated with something inside you, then like this video, leave a comment with the meditation passage that means the most to you, share this documentary with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Great Minds of Humanity, where every week we bring you the lives of the people who changed the world by first changing themselves.